Hey there, fellow literature explorers. Today, we turn our gaze toward Enemy at the Gates, a 2001 war drama that offers much more than its narrative surface. It's a text rich with thematic complexity, symbolic resonance, and intricate character work that invites rigorous analysis. I'm delighted you've joined me because in this video, we're not here for a casual brush with a period piece about snipers on opposite sides of a battlefield. We're here to unpack it like a rare, annotated manuscript, line by line, image by image, until the page beneath our fingers is worn from the weight of meaning. And before we set foot in those war-torn streets of Stalingrad, let me say this clearly. This is not a traditional review. This is an intellectual, theoretical, and critical exploration crafted for an audience with a deep appreciation for literature and layered storytelling, where film is not just entertainment, but a space for education, discourse, and insight. If this kind of close reading of cinema feels like home to you, I'd be grateful if you could like and subscribe. It's the simplest way to keep these conversations alive. This story begins with the kind of cinematic rhythm that feels more like a page from an epic poem than a standard war movie. There's an urgency in its opening moments, but not the kind that just hurls action at you. It's the urgency of a setting that's already steeped in desperation before we even arrive. The city is a skeleton of itself, and the war has reduced everything, buildings, lives, even hope, into something unrecognizable. What struck me most the first time I saw it wasn't the gunfire, but the silence in between. The moments when soldiers crouch in shadow, listening for the smallest sound, reminded me of reading war literature, where the most terrifying passages aren't about the battle, but the waiting. That sense of dread curling inward before any violence breaks loose. The film paints its war not in broad heroic strokes, but in the smudged, uneven lines of survival. This isn't a romanticized battlefield. It's a place where every movement is calculated, where trust is a fragile currency, and where the line between skill and luck blurs until you can no longer tell which one is keeping someone alive. It doesn't just follow the story of a man with a rifle, it captures the complex architecture of war as both a literal conflict and a psychological labyrinth. In its narrative construction, it feels almost novelistic. The way it introduces its protagonist isn't through the perfect shot, but through a sense of place and circumstance, how he is shaped by the space he inhabits, how the war has written itself into his body language and gaze before he even speaks. The pacing is deliberate, giving us time to watch the mechanics of strategy, the quiet recalibrations in each encounter, and the shifting web of relationships that complicate the supposed simplicity of one man against another. When the story moves into its central rivalry, it does so with the precision of a duel that plays out not in minutes, but in days. Here, the suspense isn't just in who will outshoot the other, but in the very idea that they are locked into a shared fate. The battlefield becomes their chessboard, and every piece of rubble, every shaft of sunlight cutting through the dust, becomes part of the strategy. I remember watching these scenes and thinking about how it mirrored great literary rivalries, not in sheer action, but in the way each man is forced to imagine the mind of the other. It's a battle of intellect and will as much as of aim and marksmanship. The romance woven into the narrative doesn't feel like a distraction or a softening of the war's brutality. Instead, it's like finding a single surviving thread in a tapestry that's been torn apart. There's tenderness, yes, but it's colored by the knowledge that nothing in this world is safe from loss. It made me think about how love stories set against the backdrop of war have a particular intensity, not because they are inherently more passionate, but because time feels rationed, every moment borrowed from the chaos that could reclaim it at any second. One of the most exciting threads in the plot is how the film doesn't simply build toward a single climactic confrontation and stop. It allows for a rhythm of advance and retreat, for setbacks that force both hunter and hunted to adapt. There are false leads, near misses, and moments where a single wrong calculation could have ended the game prematurely. The way the narrative handles these twists reminds me of reading a serialized novel, where each chapter leaves you leaning forward, already reaching for the next. But perhaps the most intriguing element lies in how the story uses space. The sniper's world isn't vast, it's claustrophobic. Ruins, bombed-out factories, crumbling staircases, and dark crawl spaces become a landscape of strategy and survival. In a strange way, this confinement amplifies the tension, because the world outside of their duel still rages on, reminding us that their private war is just one thread in a much larger, blood-stained tapestry. And yet, by the time you've followed them through this maze long enough, their conflict begins to feel like the center of gravity pulling everything else inward. The story also flirts with moral ambiguity, not in a way that excuses cruelty, but in a way that recognizes its inevitability in the setting. There are moments when victories feel hollow, when survival comes at the cost of something that cannot be measured in medals or headlines. These are the beats that stay with me, the ones where silence follows an action that should have brought triumph, but instead leaves the air heavy. Without giving away the exact shape of the ending, I'll say this: the resolution doesn't tie things up in a bow, because in truth, war stories rarely do. It gives you enough to exhale, but it also leaves you with the echo of every decision made along the way. The duel is settled, but the city is still a ruin, the war still burns, and the people left standing carry the weight of all those who didn't. If you watch closely, you'll notice that the real heartbeat of the story isn't just in the moment when a shot is fired. It's in the build-up, in the breath before the trigger pulls, in the way two minds try to outthink each other while navigating a world that is collapsing around them. That's where its complexity lives. It's what makes this film linger in your thoughts long after the credits roll, like the last line of a novel that refuses to let you go. It's that lingering quality, that aftertaste of tension and humanity intertwined, that makes me return to it. And maybe that's why it resonates so deeply, because it's not only about war, but about how we construct meaning inside of it, how we define ourselves in opposition to someone else, and how survival can be both a triumph and a burden. And like all great stories, it leaves just enough unanswered for you to fill in with your own reflections. It begins not with the crack of a rifle, but with the clatter of boots on steel, the chaotic shuffle of men herded into war like cattle being driven toward something they cannot yet see. The air is thick with smoke even before the shooting starts, the distant roar of artillery rolling in like a storm that never truly breaks. The city is already half dead, its bones jutting out from the rubble, its skin scorched by flame. Trains arrive in Stalingrad bursting with fresh soldiers, most barely more than boys, faces too smooth to belong here, eyes scanning the destruction as if searching for a door out. From the very first moments, you can feel the weight pressing down on this place, the kind that makes breathing a conscious effort. Amid the crush of bodies disembarking from the trains, there's a young man whose quiet stillness makes him stand out, not because he is fearless, but because he's already watching the world around him, as though every detail matters. The others chatter, stumble, ask where they are meant to go. He is already memorizing the routes, noting the shadows, sensing where the safe ground might be, if such a thing exists here at all. The first march into the city is a kind of baptism, but not into glory. The soldiers are funneled toward the river, crossing under a sky painted black with smoke. Gunfire echoes from somewhere unseen, and every sound ricochets between the ruins. The crossing itself feels like a death sentence disguised as an order. Boats ferry men across the Volga in relentless waves, each trip stripping the world on one side of the river and feeding it into the chaos on the other. Some don't even make it to shore before the air erupts with explosions, bodies tumbling into the water like stones swallowed without a trace. When the young soldier arrives at the opposite bank, the welcome is no relief. Officers bark commands with the clipped efficiency of men who know the odds are already against them. Supplies are scarce, weapons scarcer. There are rifles for some, ammunition for fewer, and for others nothing. It is an initiation by absence. No safety, no certainty, and not enough steel to go around. Men are ordered forward regardless, their fear trampled beneath the relentless machinery of command. The first engagement is chaos. The city's landscape, half standing, half shattered, is like a labyrinth designed to confuse and consume. Soldiers charge forward through streets littered with rubble, climbing over corpses without breaking stride, because to stop is to die. Machine guns chatter from concealed nests, and snipers, unseen, unblinking, pick off targets one by one. In this maelstrom, the young soldier survives not because of training, but because of instinct. He keeps to the edges, uses the ruins for cover, moves in bursts instead of straight lines. It's in one of these chaotic moments that chance, or perhaps fate, begins to pull him into the current of a larger story. Crawling through the dust-choked remains of what was once a grand building, he comes across a dropped rifle and a box of ammunition, discarded in the frenzy. It's an unremarkable weapon at first glance, but in his hands it becomes something else entirely. His eyes sharpen, his movements slow, and for the first time he seems entirely at home, not safe but certain. What happens next is less a display of bravado and more a precise act of survival. He finds his vantage point, gauges the distance, measures the wind with nothing more than instinct. When he squeezes the trigger, it's clean, unhurried, one shot then another, each finding its mark. By the time his rifle's report has faded into the ruinous symphony of the city, a handful of key enemy soldiers lie motionless. It's here that another figure enters the story, not an enemy, but a man who sees something in the young sniper that the rest have overlooked. He is older, sharper, with the air of someone who knows how to navigate both the battlefield and the political theater that surrounds it. He watches from a distance, not just the shooting, but the calm precision before it. There is opportunity here, and he knows it. In the days that follow, the sniper's kills are no longer just acts of survival. They are curated, recorded, retold. The older man ensures that word spreads, not only among the soldiers but far beyond the city's broken walls. In a war where morale is as valuable as ammunition, a single skilled marksman can become a symbol, a story that keeps the fight alive. The sniper is reluctant at first, more comfortable with action than with the idea of becoming a figurehead. But in this world, refusing a role is a luxury few can afford. As his reputation grows, so too does the pressure. He is given missions that are as much about shaping the narrative as they are about winning the fight. Sometimes the real objective isn't the kill itself, but the message it sends. His photograph begins to circulate, his name whispered with a mix of awe and expectation. This transformation from soldier to symbol changes the dynamic around him. Fellow soldiers look to him with hope or envy. Commanders speak to him like an asset, not a man. It's during one of these staged missions, designed as much for morale as for strategy, that the real turning point arrives. The enemy has taken notice, not just of his skill, but of the effect it has on their troops. A counter-sniper is brought in, one with a reputation just as deadly, and the war within the war begins. At first, it's an abstract idea, two men hunting each other in the ruins, but soon it becomes deeply personal. Their first indirect encounter is unsettling in its quietness. Shots ring out, but neither finds the other. Instead, they trade in the language of patience, a sound here, a flicker of movement there, each designed to lure the other into making a mistake. Days pass without a direct sighting, but the tension coils tighter with every moment. The sniper begins to move differently now, slower, more cautious, his eyes scanning not just for targets, but for the trap waiting in the dust. The presence of this unseen opponent changes everything. Even the missions not directly connected to him feel altered, shadowed by the knowledge that somewhere out there, a man is studying him just as closely as he is studying the enemy. Every decision feels heavier, every shot a potential revelation of his position. And in between the gunfire, there is the gnawing awareness that this duel could end at any moment, in either direction. All of this unfolds against a backdrop of a city that seems determined to resist both sides. The buildings groan under the weight of shelling, streets vanish under fresh debris, and the air itself seems to cling to the smell of gunpowder. The people who remain are ghosts of their former selves, moving quietly through what's left of their homes, clutching at scraps of food and fragments of normalcy. Through it all, the sniper continues his work, not because he believes in the legend being spun around him, but because in this fractured world, survival means adapting to the roles you're given. Still, the knowledge that there is someone out there whose sole purpose is to end him is a constant, thrumming undercurrent. It sharpens him, but it also begins to erode something unseen, a weariness that no amount of rest can touch. And so the stage is set, not only for the continuation of this deadly duel, but for the unraveling of what it means to live as both a man and a myth in a place where the line between them is as thin and fragile as a breath held before a shot. The city has settled into a kind of grim equilibrium, where the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a rifle are as much a part of the daily rhythm as the rustle of rats in the rubble. Days blur into one another in a haze of smoke, hunger, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps so deep it becomes part of your bones. But beneath that thin veil of routine, the duel tightens its grip. The sniper and his unseen adversary are now bound together in a strange, silent intimacy, two men who have never met face to face, yet know each other's habits, rhythms, and likely thoughts better than anyone else alive. Every movement becomes a test. A single step out of cover is a gamble. The angle of the sun or the glint off a scope could mean the difference between another day of survival or an abrupt, unceremonious end. There are moments when it almost feels like the city itself is conspiring to betray him, walls that crumble just enough to expose a position, dust that drifts in a sudden gust to outline his silhouette. Still, he adapts, shifting like water into whatever space will hold him without giving him away. The older man, the one who first saw the sniper's potential, remains at his side, but their dynamic has shifted. What was once a partnership now carries the tension of quiet disagreements. The mentor has his own priorities, which are tangled in politics and the war's broader propaganda machine. The sniper, meanwhile, has become wary of being used as a tool for something beyond his control. Yet, for all the tension, they are still bound by necessity. One watches the enemy, the other watches the city, and between them they hold a fragile line against the inevitable collapse. It's during one of these long, cold days in the ruins that the duel inches toward something more direct. The enemy sniper begins to leave signs, not careless mistakes, but deliberate invitations. A helmet left in the open, a movement at the edge of vision, a glint that could be a scope or just sunlight on glass. Each one is a question, daring the young marksman to answer. And each time he resists, knowing that the slightest impatience could seal his fate. There's a shift in the weather that mirrors the shift in the duel. Snow begins to fall in light, almost delicate flakes, softening the jagged outlines of the ruins. But beneath that beauty lies a danger. Tracks left in fresh snow are impossible to disguise, and sound carries differently in the frozen air. The sniper uses it to his advantage when he can, but so does his opponent. The first real breach in this careful stalemate comes not from either sniper, but from the outside world. A failed mission, unrelated to the duel, leaves the sniper's close friend dead. It's a loss that cuts deeper than he expects, not just because of the friendship, but because it reminds him how quickly the war can strip away the people who anchor him to something human. It adds a new weight to the hunt, a subtle anger that sharpens his focus but also risks clouding his judgment. In the midst of this grief, the duel escalates. Information comes in vague, but enough to suggest the enemy sniper's exact position. It's a lead too promising to ignore, yet too neat to trust entirely. The sniper decides to pursue it, creeping through the gutted remains of factories and shattered rail lines until he reaches a vantage point. Hours pass in silence, his eye pressed to the scope, breath controlled, waiting for any sign of movement. And then, at the very edge of vision, the shape of a man appears, still, deliberate, watching. The first shot is his, but it's not meant to kill. It's meant to test, to see how his opponent reacts. The return shot comes almost instantly, precise enough to shear a piece of brick inches from his head. The two exchange fire sparingly, each shot a calculated risk, each one closing the psychological distance between them. There's no more uncertainty now, they've found each other. Days follow with each man trying to force the other into an error. They change positions constantly, studying the terrain for any advantage. The ruins become a map of possibilities, each pile of rubble a potential nest, each shadow a possible threat. They use bait, decoys, and misdirection, but both are too disciplined to fall for the obvious traps. The duel stretches on, and with every passing day, the sense of inevitability grows. The breaking point comes in a way neither expects. A piece of intelligence reaches the sniper, again, through his mentor, that the enemy has been moving supplies through a certain section of the city, one that offers both cover and danger in equal measure. It's an opportunity to set an ambush, but also the perfect stage for the enemy sniper to do the same. The decision to proceed is as much about ending the uncertainty as it is about strategy. The approach is slow, deliberate. He moves before dawn, navigating through the frost-hardened debris, every step calculated to avoid noise. The cold bites into his fingers, but he ignores it, focusing only on the space ahead. The sight is quiet, too quiet, but he settles in, finding a position that offers both a clear line of sight and a potential escape route. Hours pass. The city remains still. And then a flicker barely perceptible, but enough to catch the eye trained for this kind of moment. The enemy is there, positioned perfectly, his scope sweeping in slow arcs. For a long moment, neither man moves. Then, almost imperceptibly, the enemy shifts his attention to a decoy the sniper has set earlier. It's the smallest opening, but it's enough. The shot is clean, final. There's no cinematic flourish, no grand declaration, just the sudden stillness that follows when a threat evaporates into the air. The sniper holds his position for a while longer, waiting to be certain. When he finally moves, it's with the knowledge that the duel is over, though the war itself grinds on. The return to his comrades is muted. There's no cheering, no celebration, only the quiet acknowledgement of a job done. The mentor congratulates him, but there's a heaviness in it, as though both men understand that winning a duel changes nothing about the larger tide. The sniper is still a symbol in the eyes of many, but in his own mind, he's simply someone who survived another day. In the days that follow, the city continues to crumble, the fighting shifts to new fronts, and the sniper slips back into the rhythms of survival. The duel that defines so many of his recent days becomes another chapter in a war filled with them. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he knows that this chapter will remain sharper than most, not because of the kill, but because of the strange, unspoken connection with the man who had been trying to end him. That is perhaps the truest resolution this story offers, not a sweeping victory, but the quiet realization that in war, even the most personal battles are swallowed by the larger conflict, leaving only memories behind. The city remains, battered but unbroken, and so does he, carrying with him the weight of the duel, the cost of survival, and the knowledge that tomorrow will demand just as much as yesterday did. He is introduced to us as just another soldier, swept into the chaos by the sheer momentum of history, and yet there's something about the way he moves in those opening moments that hints at a different rhythm. In a world where most men arrive wide-eyed and frantic, his gaze is already searching, weighing, calculating. Vasily doesn't burst onto the stage as a legend. He grows into it slowly, almost reluctantly, as though every step toward fame is taken with the uneasy knowledge that it will cost him something essential. His skill is undeniable, but it's his patience that makes him truly dangerous. The battlefield may be loud, but he operates in a kind of internal quiet, each shot the product of measured breath, a calculation that extends beyond just distance and wind. This calm, however, doesn't make him immune to the currents swirling around him. As his reputation grows, you can see him wrestling with the uncomfortable transformation from man to symbol. In his eyes, the kills are just survival. In the eyes of others, they become legend. That gap between his reality and the story others tell about him forms the first crack in his armor. Opposite him, and yet in many ways his mirror, is Koenig, the German sniper brought in to eliminate him. The film doesn't burden Koenig with cartoon villainy. He isn't a sneering embodiment of evil. Instead, he is methodical, professional, almost eerily calm. There's a kind of dignity in his craft, a sense that he's not here for glory, but to do a job to the absolute best of his ability. That makes him far more compelling as an antagonist because it strips away the simplicity of good versus evil. In their duel, neither man is reduced to a caricature. They're craftsmen, each with a deep respect for the other's skill, even as they seek to end the other's life. In that sense, their conflict is less about ideology and more about precision, patience, and the quiet, suffocating intimacy of two predators circling in the same cage. Between these two sharpshooters stands Danilov, the political officer whose keen eye for propaganda turns Vasily from an anonymous soldier into a hero of the Soviet Union. Danilov's transformation over the course of the story is one of the most tragic and revealing. At first, he seems entirely committed to the cause, eager to craft a figure who can inspire the masses. He takes the chaos of war and spins it into a clear, simple narrative, one man's brilliance standing against the might of the enemy. But as the myth grows, Danilov finds himself standing in its shadow. The very legend he created begins to erode his own place in the story, and that bitterness starts to leak through his loyalty. His eventual decisions, both in politics and in matters of the heart, carry the sharp tang of resentment. Yet for all his flaws, Danilov isn't without complexity. His envy is wrapped around a deep admiration for Vasily's skill, and perhaps an even deeper discomfort with his own role in sending men to die from behind a desk. Tania enters the picture as something more than just a love interest. She's a thread of humanity in a world that's been stripped to its bones. She's intelligent, resourceful, and fiercely driven by personal loss. Having seen her own family destroyed by the war, she has no illusions about its brutality. She fights not for ideology, but for the memory of those she's lost, and for the hope that such losses might someday be prevented. In Vasily, she sees not only a skilled soldier, but someone who, like her, has been shaped and scarred by the violence around them. Their connection isn't the sweeping, cinematic romance of peacetime. It's forged in the immediacy of survival, in whispered conversations in shadowed corners, in moments snatched from the jaws of death. Yet this bond also becomes a point of tension, especially as Danilov's feelings for her deepen, adding a human layer of rivalry that mirrors the deadly duel between Vasily and Koenig. Koenig's presence in the story doesn't just serve as a catalyst for tension, it reframes Vasily's entire arc. Before Koenig, Vasily's kills are largely anonymous, faceless soldiers falling at distances so great they might as well be silhouettes. But in Koenig, he finds someone who stares back through the scope, who forces him to confront the intimacy of killing. Each failed attempt to outwit the other is a reminder that this is no longer war in the abstract. This is a battle between two men who know they may never speak a word to each other, but will nonetheless come to know the other's habits, flaws, and strengths as intimately as their own. In this way, Koenig becomes less an enemy in the national sense and more a rival in the purest human sense. Theirs is a relationship built entirely on the anticipation of ending it. Even the city itself feels like a character here. Stalingrad isn't just a backdrop, it shapes the psychology of everyone within it. The ruins dictate strategy, the bombed-out buildings create claustrophobic pockets where life clings stubbornly to the edges, and the ever-present danger strips every decision down to its essentials. For Vasily, the city is both a hunting ground and a prison. For Koenig, it is an alien landscape he must learn to navigate without the comfort of home ground advantage. And for Tania and Danilov, the city becomes a crucible where ideals are tested and eroded by the constant grind of survival. The secondary characters, though given less screen time, are crucial in filling out the moral and emotional texture of the story. Fellow soldiers, weary and pragmatic, serve as reminders that behind every duel and every headline-worthy shot, there are countless other lives being spent at the same rate, with far less recognition. Their interactions with Vasily often carry a subtle edge, admiration for his skill, yes, but also the quiet resentment of those who know their own contributions will be forgotten. These moments ground the larger-than-life elements of the plot in the messy, unglamorous reality of war. What makes the characters in this story resonate so deeply is that none of them are allowed to remain static. Vasily shifts from anonymity to reluctant fame, and from confidence to the uneasy recognition of his own myth. Danilov moves from conviction to disillusionment, his loyalty fraying as personal feelings muddy his ideals. Tania navigates love, loss, and survival, refusing to be reduced to a passive role. Koenig remains steady in his skill, yet even he cannot remain untouched by the drawn-out nature of the duel. His precision begins to show the faintest cracks under the weight of the hunt. By the time the story reaches its resolution, the changes in these characters feel earned. Vasily emerges from the duel victorious in a technical sense, but altered in ways that have nothing to do with marksmanship. He's seen the cost of being a symbol, felt the weight of every life taken, and learned that even the cleanest victory leaves behind a residue that cannot be washed away. Danilov's final moments are shaped by a complex blend of regret and a belated understanding of what his manipulations have wrought. Tania's survival feels both fragile and defiant, a refusal to let the war define her entirely. Koenig's end is quiet, almost stripped of drama, which makes it all the more haunting. In the end, the character dynamics here are what elevate the story beyond a simple wartime rivalry. Each person is driven by forces larger than themselves, yet each makes choices, small human choices, that ripple through the lives around them. And it's in those ripples, not just the climactic moments, that the true heart of the story beats. There's a strange intimacy to films like this, ones that seem so deeply rooted in the chaos and grime of war that you almost forget there's a camera crew just out of frame. And yet, behind the lens, the making of this story unfolded with its own kind of battles, smaller, less deadly than those depicted on screen, but no less intense for those involved. What's fascinating is that so many of the behind-the-scenes moments carry the same themes you feel in the film itself: patience, precision, and a constant negotiation between chaos and control. One of the most unusual choices in the production was the decision to shoot in actual abandoned industrial and urban landscapes, rather than relying entirely on studio sets. Large sections of the war-torn city were painstakingly reconstructed in disused factories and vast open yards, where rubble, wrecked vehicles, and partially destroyed facades could be arranged to mimic Stalingrad's devastated streets. This created an authenticity you can feel in every frame, the texture of the walls, the way the light falls through shattered windows, but it also meant that the cast and crew were often working in bitterly cold, inhospitable conditions. There were days when the breath you see billowing from the actors' mouths wasn't a special effect. It was simply the reality of standing in freezing temperatures for hours at a time. The cold wasn't the only element the production embraced. The snow you see falling in certain scenes is sometimes real, sometimes artificial, but in both cases, it was used with almost obsessive attention to continuity. The crew would halt shooting entirely if natural snowfall changed mid-take, forcing them to wait for conditions to match the earlier shots. It's the sort of detail you might never consciously notice as a viewer, yet it's crucial in maintaining the illusion that you're watching events unfold in a seamless, continuous world. And then there's the matter of the duel itself, the long, tense sniper hunt that forms the backbone of the story. To bring that to life, the filmmakers consulted with military historians and actual snipers to ensure the tactics, body positioning, and even breathing patterns were accurate. Both Jude Law and Ed Harris trained extensively in handling period-appropriate rifles, learning not just how to fire them, but how to move with them, clean them, and use the environment to their advantage. Harris, in particular, became so adept at manipulating the rifle that crew members swore he could hit his mark, even if the camera wasn't rolling, a testament to his methodical approach to embodying Koenig. One of the strangest little production quirks involved the way the rifle scopes were treated on set. The scopes were real and fully functional, but to capture the unique look of peering through one, cinematographer Robert Frace and his team experimented with a series of lens tricks. They ended up building specialized rigs that could mount the film camera in line with the rifle scope, allowing them to capture the distorted, slightly vignetted image you see when characters take aim. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was about immersing the audience in the intimate, nerve-fraying experience of looking through the glass, where the world narrows to a single figure moving in the crosshairs. There were also moments of unexpected levity during filming, even in the most serious sequences. The duel required long hours of stillness, with actors lying prone in rubble or crouched in shadow for take after take. Between setups, Law and Harris reportedly engaged in dry, understated banter about who would break first, though it wasn't always the actors who cracked. On more than one occasion, crew members manning the cameras were the ones who shifted, dropped equipment, or stifled laughter at a perfectly timed, deadpan comment from one of the two leads. The tension on screen might have been suffocating, but between shots, the set could dissolve into brief flashes of warmth. Another odd production story centers on Rachel Weisz's role as Tania. The filmmakers wanted her costumes to reflect the scarcity of wartime life without resorting to theatrical exaggeration. This meant sourcing actual vintage garments from the 1940s, many of which were fragile to the point of disintegrating under the lights. In one memorable incident, a sleeve tore clean off during a scene, and rather than halting production, Weisz stayed in character and completed the take. The moment didn't make it into the final cut, but it became one of those set anecdotes that everyone remembered, an example of the kind of improvisation that often goes unnoticed but shapes the energy of a performance. The production also had its fair share of logistical challenges. Coordinating the extras for the massive crowd and battle sequences required military-like precision. Some days saw upwards of 100 background performers in full uniform, moving through carefully choreographed patterns of combat, retreat, and regrouping. The sheer size of these setups meant that even minor changes, like a misfired blank or a missing prop, could throw the timing off for an entire scene, forcing a reset that could take hours. The crew learned to work with a combination of rigid planning and flexibility, ready to adapt when weather, equipment, or human error intervened. One of the more quietly fascinating aspects of the production is how much of it was about building psychological atmosphere rather than just physical realism. The sound design team spent weeks collecting recordings of actual period weapons being fired in open spaces, enclosed rooms, and across varying distances. These sounds were layered and mixed with ambient noises, creaking buildings, distant shouting, the whisper of wind through ruins, to create an auditory landscape that shifts subtly from scene to scene. In the duel sequences, the mix becomes almost surgical, stripping away anything unnecessary so that every scrape of fabric, every breath, every metallic click rings out like a warning. There's also a bit of strange trivia about the way the camera moves in certain scenes. Director Jean-Jacques Annaud and his cinematographer often chose long, deliberate tracking shots over rapid cutting, especially in the duel sequences. This wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was rooted in the psychology of sniping itself. Snipers are trained to think in terms of slow, deliberate action, conserving energy, and waiting for the perfect moment. By mirroring this rhythm in the camera's movement, the filmmakers subtly pull the audience into the mindset of the characters, making you feel the drag of time, the weight of stillness. One of the most surprising behind-the-scenes facts is that some of the film's most intense moments were actually shot in relative quiet, with no gunfire or explosions during filming. The pyrotechnics and sound effects were added later, allowing the actors to maintain focus without the distraction of loud, disorienting noises. This created a peculiar disconnect. On set, the duel might feel like two men simply lying in the cold, staring through scopes, but in the final cut, those moments bristle with danger and urgency. A small but telling detail, the dirt, grime, and soot on the actors' faces wasn't always makeup. On particularly windy days, the set's dusty environment coated everyone in a fine layer of grit. Rather than clean it off, the makeup team would work it into the overall look, enhancing the sense that these characters lived in a place where clean skin was a luxury. For Jude Law, this meant that by the end of certain shooting days, the costume on his face was as much environmental as it was artistic. There's even a story about the Volga River scenes. These sequences, which depict soldiers being ferried into Stalingrad under heavy fire, were shot on a combination of real water and controlled tank environments. For the river shots, safety was paramount, but the cold was unavoidable. To achieve the look of shivering, exhausted men, the crew simply had to let the chill seep in, though they did provide heated tents and dry clothing as soon as each take ended. Actors later described these scenes as some of the most physically grueling, not because of the stunt work, but because of the numbing cold that settled into their bones. Perhaps the strangest thing about the film's production is how much it relied on stillness rather than spectacle. While there are large-scale battle scenes, the emotional core is two men lying in wait, watching, thinking. The crew had to adjust to a rhythm unlike most war films, where the big moments are explosions and charges. Here, the big moments are a shift in shadow, a twitch of a hand, a decision made in silence. That kind of storytelling demands patience from everyone involved: actors, camera operators, lighting techs, and when you watch the final product, you can feel that collective restraint in every frame. And maybe that's the most telling fact of all. The production itself became a kind of mirror to the story it was telling. Just as Vasily and Koenig played their long, careful game of waiting each other out, the filmmakers played a similar game with the audience, crafting a world where tension isn't about the volume of the noise, but about the spaces between the sounds, the moments before the trigger is pulled. In both cases, the reward comes not from rushing to the end, but from living fully in the stillness along the way. The opening movement of this story does not ease the viewer into its world, it thrusts them into it with a violence that is both physical and psychological. The arrival of young soldiers across the Volga is not just an establishing set piece, it is a statement of intent. From a critical perspective, this event serves as a kind of thesis for the film. War here will be stripped of any romantic pretense. There is no heroic fanfare as the boats approach the city, only the tight, suffocating space of the vessel, the resigned expressions of those aboard, and the omnipresent whistle of incoming artillery. This is the first major beat that sets the tone. It's an act of visual rhetoric, telling us that survival is a matter of chance, and that in this world, even reaching the battlefield alive is a kind of victory. The immediate chaos of the landing underscores the systemic brutality of the Soviet command at this time. It's not just the enemy that threatens these men, it's their own officers, who enforce discipline at gunpoint. Critics have often highlighted this sequence as one of the film's most morally unsettling moments, not because it is gratuitous, but because it dismantles the illusion that all cruelty in war flows in a single direction. The Soviet soldiers who fail to advance are cut down not by Germans, but by their own side. This reframing challenges a simple binary of good versus evil, instead painting war as a system of overlapping violences, where ideology is as lethal as bullets. From there, the narrative pivots to its first moment of concentrated skill and myth-making, Vasily's sniper work among the rubble. On the surface, this is the scene that first introduces us to his extraordinary talent. But if you look more closely, this is also where the film starts to unpack the idea of war as performance. Danilov watches Vasily through binoculars, and in that moment, the young soldier is transformed in the political officer's eyes from a mere survivor into a figure worth crafting into a symbol. The precision of Vasily's shots matters not just for their tactical value, but for their narrative potential. This is the spark of propaganda, and critics have long noted that the scene is about the birth of a myth as much as the taking of lives. The following montage of Danilov's campaign to elevate Vasily's image is another critical pivot point. Here, the film moves beyond the personal story and into the mechanics of political storytelling. Handwritten flyers, printed bulletins, and whispered anecdotes spread through the ranks, transforming a man into a legend. From a critical lens, this sequence reveals the symbiotic relationship between war and narrative. Victory in the battlefield is mirrored by victory in controlling the story of the war. The soldiers who read about Vasily are not necessarily inspired by his real-life actions. They're inspired by the story they've been told. This blurring between reality and constructed image will haunt Vasily for the rest of the narrative. The introduction of Koenig is where the tension crystallizes into something deeply personal. His arrival is not heralded with bombast. Instead, it's measured and deliberate, much like the man himself. The first significant event involving him is the subtle, unseen shift in the battle's energy. Suddenly, Soviet officers are dying in ways that suggest careful, calculated work. The sniper duel begins not with a face-to-face confrontation, but with a series of invisible exchanges, shots taken and evaded, traps set and narrowly avoided. This slow-burn approach mirrors the psychological game being played between the two men. From a critical standpoint, this is where the film's war drama transitions into a duel of intellect and patience, transforming the sprawling chaos of Stalingrad into a series of claustrophobic encounters between two minds. The interplay between Vasily and Tania also marks a significant turning point. Their connection offers the rare intrusion of tenderness into an otherwise hostile world, but it's not an uncomplicated romance. Critics have argued that their relationship is less about romantic fulfillment and more about mutual recognition, two people who see in each other the scars of survival. In the broader thematic architecture, these moments act as a counterpoint to the duel with Koenig. Where the duel is about separation, concealment, and killing, the relationship is about closeness, honesty, and the attempt to preserve life. The fragility of this connection only heightens the tension, as the audience senses that in a world built on attrition, such bonds are rarely allowed to endure. The death of Kulikov, Vasili's mentor in some respects, is another moment critics often linger on. It's not just the loss of an ally, it's a turning point in the duel, one that forces Vasily to confront the psychological weight of the hunt. Kulikov's death is engineered with brutal precision by Koenig, demonstrating that the German sniper is not merely reacting to Vasily, but actively shaping the rules of their engagement. This moment resonates thematically because it strips away any lingering illusion of invincibility. Vasily, who has been elevated to near-mythic status by Danilov's propaganda, is suddenly and unmistakably vulnerable. The duel is no longer a matter of if he can be beaten, but when. One of the most devastating narrative turns comes when Tania is injured during an attack. Her injury is not the result of a clean, targeted act, but of the chaotic, indiscriminate violence that defines most of the conflict. From a critical perspective, this moment serves as a brutal reminder that in war, even the most personal battles are fought within a larger storm that cares nothing for individual struggles. Vasily's duel with Koenig may feel like the axis of the world to those involved, but Tania's injury exposes it as a thread woven into a much larger tapestry of suffering. The personal and the collective are in constant collision here, and it's in these collisions that the film's emotional resonance is strongest. Danilov's arc reaches its breaking point in a scene that is as thematically rich as it is narratively consequential. His jealousy over Vasily's relationship with Tania combines with his growing bitterness over his own role in the war. In a moment of emotional weakness, and perhaps self-destruction, he betrays Vasily's position to Koenig. This act is a fascinating inversion of his earlier role. The man who built Vasily's myth now actively works to dismantle it. Critics often point to this betrayal as the culmination of the film's meditation on envy and propaganda, showing how the stories we tell about others can become prisons for both the subject and the storyteller. The final confrontation between Vasily and Koenig is not staged as a grand crescendo of action, but as the quietest of reckonings. It is a scene defined by restraint, both in performance and in direction. Koenig's death is not a triumphant moment. It's an inevitable conclusion to a game that has gone on too long. The choice to strip the scene of excessive music or stylized violence emphasizes the emptiness of the victory. From a critical standpoint, this ending denies the audience the catharsis they might expect from a conventional war film. The duel ends, but the war does not. One man's survival changes nothing in the grand scheme, and the cost of that survival is etched into every line of Vasily's face. Even the denouement carries a muted quality. The survivors drift toward whatever future they can carve from the ruins, but there is no suggestion of clear resolution. In this way, the film aligns itself with a tradition of war narratives that reject closure in favor of lingering unease. The personal rivalries and intimate dramas that have unfolded against the backdrop of the Eastern Front may feel monumental to the characters, but in the broader scope of history, they are swallowed by the sheer scale of the conflict. Critically, the events of the story have been read through multiple lenses. Some see it as a tale of individual heroism and skill, others as a deconstruction of such myths. Some focus on its depiction of Soviet propaganda as both a weapon and a prison, while others are drawn to its portrayal of the duel as an allegory for the cold precision and moral ambiguity of modern warfare. The beauty of the film lies in its ability to sustain these readings simultaneously, allowing different viewers to find their own entry point into the material, and perhaps that is the ultimate measure of its impact. The key events, the landing at Stalingrad, the crafting of a sniper's legend, the slow, deliberate duel, the betrayals and injuries and quiet reckonings, are not isolated set pieces. They are threads in a larger pattern, each one pulling at the themes of survival, identity, and the corrosive effects of war on the human spirit. The emotional resonance comes not from the spectacle of battle, but from the intimate, human-scale decisions made within it. These are choices about trust, about love, about the stories we tell and the ones we try to escape. And in the end, those choices linger far longer than the sound of any rifle shot. The making of this film was, in many ways, as much a war story as the one it set out to tell. Not in the sense of life-or-death combat, of course, but in the long campaign of problem-solving, adaptation, and sheer endurance that goes into bringing a story of this scale and intensity to the screen. Every battle scene, every whispered sniper exchange, every shattered street corner had to be built, rehearsed, and executed with a precision that mirrored the subject matter. And behind it all was an army of crew members working tirelessly to make the illusion seamless. One of the most striking decisions the production made early on was to forego extensive digital environments in favor of physically constructing large swaths of the war-torn city. The art department, led by set designers who'd studied both period photographs and historical records of the Battle of Stalingrad, built an enormous, meticulously detailed replica of the city's bombed-out districts. This wasn't just a facade for the camera. These were real, three-dimensional environments that the actors could walk through, climb over, and inhabit. Piles of rubble were placed exactly as they might have been after artillery strikes, with debris carefully chosen to match the materials used in the city during the 1940s. The result was that the actors weren't just pretending to be in Stalingrad, they were standing in a chillingly accurate recreation of it. The scope of this set construction was so massive that it became its own logistical challenge. Whole streets were built in a disused industrial area, complete with damaged buildings, shattered windows, and smoke-blackened walls. The special effects team embedded squibs and breakaway sections into the structures so that explosions could be staged without compromising safety. Even the smallest details, bullet holes pockmarking brickwork, or the way sunlight filtered through a partially collapsed roof, were painstakingly arranged to match the tone of each scene. And because many of the key sniper sequences required shots to be matched from multiple angles over several days, the set had to be perfectly dressed each morning to maintain continuity. The director Jean-Jacques Annaud was insistent on immersing his cast and crew in as close to the real atmosphere as possible. While this sometimes meant enduring discomfort, cold winds, damp conditions, long hours outdoors, it also gave the performances a rawness that couldn't be faked. Jude, who played Vasily, later said that stepping onto the set each morning felt like walking into a frozen photograph of the past, and that the bleakness of the environment made it easier to inhabit the mental state of his character. Costume design was another arena where the production went to extraordinary lengths. Wardrobe supervisor and her team sourced authentic Soviet and German military uniforms from private collections, surplus depots, and historical archives. When authentic pieces couldn't be found, replicas were created using period-appropriate fabrics and tailoring techniques. These uniforms weren't just costumes, they were functional, layered for warmth, and designed to withstand the rough conditions of the set. That authenticity extended to the wear and tear on the clothing. The wardrobe department would distress each uniform by hand, adding mud, soot, frayed edges, and even faint traces of sweat and oil to make them look truly lived in. The weapons were equally accurate, with the prop department providing fully functioning period rifles that had been deactivated for safety. For the duel scenes between Vasily and Koenig, the rifles were outfitted with scopes identical to those used during the war. Both Jude and Ed Harris underwent weapons training, not just to learn how to fire, but to handle their rifles in a way that felt second nature. They practiced lying prone for long stretches, adjusting their breathing, and using the environment for cover, all small details that would make their movements convincing to audiences and historians alike. Sound played a bigger role in the production process than most people realize. While the thunderous gunfire and explosions might seem like the obvious audio challenges, Annaud and his sound team were equally concerned with the quieter moments. The scrape of a rifle bolt, the faint whistle of wind through the ruins, the slow crunch of boots over snow. Many of these sounds were recorded live on set, with boom operators working in near silence during takes to capture the most delicate noises. When live recording wasn't possible, Foley artists recreated them in painstaking detail, sometimes using unusual techniques, like snapping celery to mimic the subtle crack of breaking wood or rubbing sandpaper on fabric to create the sound of worn cloth brushing against stone. The production also had its share of unpredictable moments that became stories in their own right. During one scene, an artificial snow machine malfunctioned, dumping far more snow than intended onto the set. Rather than stop filming, Annaud decided to keep rolling, and the actors adapted their movements to navigate the sudden drifts. The result was a visually striking moment that ended up staying in the final cut, a happy accident born from technical failure. Then there were the days when the weather became its own antagonist. Shooting in open, unheated locations meant that temperatures could swing from tolerable to brutally cold in the span of a few hours. Cast and crew wore thermal layers under their costumes and coats, but there were still moments when hands stiffened, breath clouded the air, and equipment froze. On one particularly cold morning, the oil in the camera mechanisms thickened so much that the crew had to set up portable heaters around the lenses to get them functioning again. Despite these challenges, the atmosphere on set was reportedly warm and collaborative. Harris and Law, whose characters are locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse, often shared light moments between takes. Harris, with his dry humor, would sometimes break the tension by joking about the perils of lying still for hours. Law, meanwhile, enjoyed experimenting with different physical positions during rehearsals to see how they might alter the visual storytelling of a sniper's patience. Rachel Weisz, too, brought a quiet intensity to her role that inspired those around her, but she wasn't above joining in on the occasional on-set joke, often diffusing the heavy mood after emotionally draining scenes. One of the crew's favorite anecdotes involved a scene requiring a large crowd of extras to react to an enemy attack. The extras, many of them locals, threw themselves into the performance with such enthusiasm that several actually stumbled into the camera's frame, forcing a reset. The director, rather than scolding, praised them for their energy and used the incident as an opportunity to rehearse the scene's timing more precisely. That collaborative spirit carried through the rest of the shoot, with the local participants taking great pride in their contributions. Another unexpected quirk of production came during the editing process. The duel between Vasily and Koenig was originally scripted with more direct exchanges, faster cuts between the two snipers, more moments of near misses, but during the first rough cut, Annaud realized that slowing the pacing made the tension far more unbearable. The edit was reworked to include longer, sustained shots of each man waiting, watching, and calculating. This small change in rhythm transformed the tone of the duel from a standard action sequence into something closer to a psychological thriller. Even the score, composed by James Horner, was deeply integrated into the production philosophy. Horner worked closely with Annaud to ensure that the music supported the emotional arc without overwhelming it. Certain cues were recorded and played on set during filming to help the actors sink into the mood of a scene. This practice is rare in filmmaking, but can create a unique synergy between performance and music, as actors naturally pace their movements to the underlying score. Looking back, one of the most remarkable aspects of the production was how many elements were handled practically rather than digitally. Explosions, debris showers, and even much of the gunfire were staged with real pyrotechnics and blank ammunition, giving the actors tangible stimuli to react to. This commitment to physicality made the danger feel immediate and real, not just for the audience, but for those performing it. Perhaps the most enduring fun fact from the shoot is that, despite the film's grim subject matter, the set was often full of camaraderie. Crew members celebrated birthdays with improvised cakes made from whatever they could scrounge from the catering tent. A few even engaged in good-natured snowball fights between takes, only to be called back to their posts for the next grim, slow-burn duel scene. It was this balance, the weight of the story and the lightness of human connection, that kept everyone going through the long, cold days. In the end, the production was as much a testament to endurance and precision as the story it brought to life. Every weather delay, every set reconstruction, every hour spent lying still for the sake of one perfect shot mirrored the patience and focus of the characters themselves. And just as the duel in the story required a balance of skill, adaptability, and nerve, so too did the making of the film. It was a battle fought not with rifles and scopes, but with cameras, lights, and the quiet determination to tell a story that would linger long after the credits rolled. The setting of this film is not merely a backdrop. It is the pulse, the breath, and in many ways the antagonist that shapes every decision the characters make. Stalingrad is not just a place here, it is an unrelenting force, a city broken and burning, yet somehow still alive in its ruins. From the very first frame, the audience is pulled into a world that feels oppressive not just in its danger, but in its suffocating intimacy. The vastness of war is somehow made claustrophobic, as though every brick, every shadow, every shattered wall is leaning in on the characters, closing the space between life and death. When we first glimpse the city, it is through a haze of smoke and frost. The palette is cold and washed out, with grays and browns dominating, as if the color has been drained from the world by the war's relentless appetite. The cinematography makes deliberate use of these muted tones to evoke a feeling of exhaustion, of a landscape bled dry. This choice is crucial. It's not the romanticized rubble of a war epic, it's the real, unflinching ugliness of destruction. Rubble isn't just rubble here, it's jagged, sharp, and dangerous. Streets aren't open pathways but corridors of death, every step potentially visible to an unseen enemy's scope. The Volga River is one of the first major landmarks we're shown, and it serves as more than a geographical marker. It is a barrier between the soldiers, lives before and after crossing it. In those opening scenes, the river becomes a silent executioner, swallowing men under relentless artillery fire before they even set foot on the shore. The cinematographer frames it in long, unbroken shots, emphasizing the inevitability of the crossing. There is no way around it. This sense of inevitability pervades the whole setting. Whether it's crossing the river, navigating the city, or facing Koenig, the geography offers no escape. Once inside Stalingrad, the streets and buildings take on a labyrinthine quality. The production design leans heavily into verticality, characters moving up and down staircases, crawling through holes in floors, or lying prone on rooftops. This layering of space serves two purposes. It provides tactical realism for the sniper duel, and it creates visual depth that keeps the viewer feeling boxed in. Every layer of the city can hide danger. Every vantage point is both a weapon and a liability. You can see far, but you can be seen farther. Cinematographer Robert Frase's camera work amplifies this sensation by oscillating between two extremes, sweeping aerial views that show the devastating scope of the battlefield and suffocating close-ups that lock us into the subjective experience of the characters. The wide shots are used sparingly, almost as palette cleansers between sequences of intense, ground-level action. They remind us of the larger machinery of war churning around the central duel, but they also emphasize how small and exposed an individual is in this arena. The close-ups, on the other hand, pull us into the granular details, the trembling of hands adjusting a scope, the glint of light off a lens, the slight tightening of a jaw before a trigger pull. Lighting plays a subtle but powerful role in crafting the mood. The interiors are often lit by what appears to be natural sources, weak sunlight filtering through dust-covered windows, flickering flames from oil lamps, the faint glow of a distant fire. This creates a low contrast, almost painterly effect, grounding the film in a realism that heightens the stakes. When light is harsh, it is often because it is dangerous. Beams cutting through the dust make a sniper's position more visible, or sudden flares expose the battlefield in stark relief. Darkness, conversely, is not a safe haven here. It's just another form of uncertainty. Shadows shift and swallow shapes, and the absence of visibility becomes its own form of tension. The sniper duel scenes make especially clever use of space and cinematography. The cat-and-mouse game between Vasily and Koenig unfolds in a variety of microenvironments within the larger war zone. An abandoned factory, a train yard, the skeletal remains of apartment blocks. Each of these spaces is distinct, but they share a common visual language, limited sightlines, layers of cover, and a sense that the environment itself is conspiring to trap the characters. The camera often positions us in over-the-shoulder perspectives, aligning us with one sniper's point of view before abruptly cutting to the others, creating a rhythm of hunting and being hunted. The sound design complements this visual tension brilliantly. In many of the sniper sequences, ambient noise drops to an almost unnatural stillness. The sounds that remain are amplified. A distant footstep, the metallic slide of a rifle bolt, the whisper of fabric against stone. The silence between shots becomes as nerve-wracking as the shots themselves, turning the space between events into a kind of cinematic quicksand. The use of the city's architecture is also worth noting. Many scenes are staged in spaces that have been reduced to fragments. A single intact wall surrounded by rubble, half a roof sheltering a shadowy corner, a staircase leading to nowhere. These broken spaces do more than just look authentic. They become metaphors for the fractured moral and emotional landscape of the characters. Nothing is whole here, not the city, not the people, not even the ideals they're fighting for. One of the most evocative settings in the film is the factory where a key sequence of the duel takes place. The structure is massive yet skeletal, with beams and girders cutting the frame into a grid of intersecting lines. This creates a visual echo of a rifle's crosshairs, reinforcing the central motif of the sniper's gaze. Dust motes hang in the air, catching light in a way that both obscures and reveals, making it impossible to know whether you're hidden or exposed. It's an environment built for paranoia. There's also a notable contrast between the exteriors and the few interiors we see. Outside, the city feels like an open wound, raw, cold, and unending. Inside, whether it's a cramped sniper nest or the dim space where Vasily and Tania share a rare moment of tenderness, the atmosphere shifts. Interiors are tighter, warmer in tone, and often lit from below or behind, creating a sense of refuge, however temporary. But even these spaces are never entirely safe. The war always finds a way in, whether through the distant rumble of artillery or the sudden shatter of glass. The final confrontation between Vasily and Koenig is a masterclass in the interplay between setting and tension. It unfolds in a location that feels both vast and claustrophobic, a bombed-out industrial space with long sightlines broken by debris. The way the camera moves through this space mirrors the cautious, deliberate movements of the characters. Each step forward feels dangerous, each pause pregnant with the possibility of being caught in a scope's view. The lighting here is particularly striking, muted daylight diffused through smoke, creating a hazy, dreamlike quality that paradoxically makes the danger feel sharper. Throughout the film, the interplay between the physical setting and the characters' inner states is constant. Stalingrad's ruins are not just the arena for the duel, they are an extension of it. Every jagged edge, every blind corner, every expanse of exposed ground becomes part of the psychological chess match. In this way, the setting is not passive. It's active, alive, and complicit in the shaping of events. The visual tone, with its restrained color palette and unflinching realism, ensures that the setting is never just pretty or cinematic for its own sake. The beauty, when it appears, is always tinged with tragedy. A sunrise over the river marred by drifting smoke, the delicate fall of snow settling on a corpse. These moments remind us that war exists alongside the world's natural rhythms, warping them but never fully erasing them. By the time the credits roll, the audience has not just seen the setting, they've felt it. The city's ruins, the narrow alleys, the broken interiors, and the wide-open killing grounds have all imprinted themselves into the narrative. The setting has shaped the story at every turn, not as a passive container but as an active participant. And in doing so, it becomes one of the most enduring elements of the film, an unspoken character whose presence is felt long after the final shot is fired. Some films are remembered purely for their narrative power on screen, others are remembered equally for the odyssey of their creation. This one belongs to the second category. The behind-the-scenes journey was itself a small epic, full of unexpected hurdles, bursts of camaraderie, moments of near disaster, and flashes of human warmth that contrasted beautifully with the cold brutality of the story being told. It is one thing to watch a sniper duel in the midst of Stalingrad's ruins. It is quite another to realize that dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people worked in unison to recreate that moment with such painstaking detail. Jean-Jacques Annaud had a reputation for creating immersive, all-encompassing environments for his actors, and here he doubled down on that philosophy. Rather than rely heavily on green screens or CGI, still in a comparatively early stage in the early 2000s, he insisted on building enormous practical sets. These weren't just facades, they were full, walkable environments. When you stepped onto the main Stalingrad set, you could wander for blocks through skeletal buildings, charred walls, and blasted streets. You could walk into doorways, climb staircases, lean against rubble that was cold and solid under your palms. That authenticity came at a cost. The construction alone took months, and the scale was so massive that crew members began referring to it as the Stalingrad Project, as though it were a separate city being erected beside their actual shooting location. Local workers were hired to help assemble the rubble and weather the facades, many of them veterans of construction who brought an extra layer of reality to the broken masonry and warped steel beams. The rubble piles weren't just dumped in place, they were arranged with an artful eye, informed by wartime photographs and battlefield reports. Even the soot and ash had to be meticulously applied so it would catch the light in exactly the right way. Filming within such a massive and detailed set created its own brand of logistical challenges. Navigating the space with cranes, dollies, and lights meant that every movement had to be choreographed as carefully as a battle sequence. The crew developed quiet hand signals and walkie-talkie codes to coordinate equipment shifts without disrupting the tense on-set atmosphere. Sometimes in the middle of a take, a background effect, like a distant smoke plume or a controlled explosion, would misfire slightly, requiring an immediate reset. When that happened, the entire crew, from camera operators to set dressers, would work in seamless concert to restore the space to its exact pre-shot state. One memorable incident involved a scene where Jude Law's character had to crawl across a destroyed factory floor, with beams of sunlight streaming down through a shattered roof. The lighting crew had worked for hours to achieve just the right angle for the shafts of light, using massive reflectors to bounce daylight into the dim space. But midway through the first take, a stray gust of wind shifted the angle of one reflector by just a few degrees, subtly altering the composition. Annaud, with his meticulous eye, caught the change immediately and called for a halt. Instead of frustration, the moment sparked a kind of collective determination. Grips, electricians, and even a few curious actors pitched in to help realign the reflector and secure it against further movement. The teamwork turned what could have been a tedious delay into a strangely uplifting experience. Ed Harris, portraying the German sniper Koenig, had a dry, understated humor that became a lifeline during long, cold days of shooting. He would sometimes break the tension between takes by remarking on how dangerous it was to lie perfectly still for hours, or by mock complaining about the heavy burden of having to look effortlessly menacing on cue. His banter with Jude Law was playful, but also subtly competitive, each man privately determined to make the other elevate his performance. Rachel Weisz, whose role provided some of the film's most poignant emotional beats, was known on set for her quiet focus. She wasn't one to make a spectacle of her preparation, but crew members noticed how she would slip into her character's mindset even before cameras rolled, adjusting her body language and facial expressions as though tuning an instrument. Still, she wasn't immune to moments of levity. One day, during a break between takes, she and Law staged a mock duel, using camera tripods as pretend rifles, much to the amusement of the crew. The physical demands of the production tested everyone. Much of the film was shot in cold, damp conditions, and though the actors wore authentic military uniforms, those layers didn't always provide much comfort against the chill. The production team made sure that hot drinks and warm tents were always nearby, but there were still days when numb fingers and clouded breath became part of the performance. Jude recalled one scene in which he had to remain prone on a cold concrete surface for so long that he could barely feel his hands by the end of the take. Rather than break character, he channeled that discomfort into his portrayal of Vasily's strain and exhaustion. Animal handling, though not a major part of the film, brought its own quirks. In one scene, pigeons were used to add life to a crumbling rooftop environment. The bird wrangler was a local expert who had trained the pigeons to fly on cue, but on the day of shooting, one particularly headstrong bird refused to take direction. Instead of flying off camera, it perched on a ledge in full view, staring curiously at the actors. Annaud, rather than cutting, decided to keep rolling, later remarking that the pigeon's stillness oddly heightened the scene's tension. Meals became a cherished part of the daily routine, not just for sustenance but for morale. The catering team worked miracles to provide hot, hearty food in challenging conditions. On particularly grueling days, Annaud would join the lunch line with the crew, chatting casually about the day's challenges or sharing stories from past productions. These moments of egalitarian interaction helped maintain a sense of shared purpose, reinforcing that everyone, from lead actors to the youngest production assistant, was part of the same mission. The sniper duel scenes were, unsurprisingly, the most technically complex to film. They required not just precise camera placement, but also the alignment of lighting, set dressing, and even the dust in the air to maintain continuity across multiple shooting days. This meant that sometimes a scene would be paused for hours while the crew adjusted a single element. Patience became the most valuable currency on set. Harrison Law used these pauses to rehearse subtle physical beats, how they shifted their weight, how they scanned the environment, ensuring that even the smallest gestures told part of the story. Perhaps one of the most surprising aspects for those outside the production was how much of the gunfire and explosions were done practically. Pyrotechnics experts staged real detonations in controlled conditions, filling the air with genuine dust and debris. This gave the actors something tangible to react to, which in turn made their performances more grounded. Of course, this also meant that safety protocols were incredibly strict. Before any pyrotechnic shot, the set would go silent as crew leaders ran final checks, and only when every person was accounted for and protected would the countdown to detonation begin. There were also days when the unexpected intervened. One afternoon, just as cameras were ready to roll on a pivotal scene, a sudden hailstorm swept through the set. The icy pellets clattered off helmets, bounced across the rubble, and made such a racket that recording clean sound became impossible. Instead of packing up for the day, Annaud had shifted gears, using the storm as an opportunity to capture atmospheric inserts, close-ups of hail hitting the ground, water running through cracks in the rubble, elements that would later be woven into the film's texture. By the end of filming, a genuine bond had formed among the cast and crew. They had endured cold, long hours and countless resets together, and the shared hardships had created a sense of camaraderie that's hard to fake. When the final scene was shot, the wrap party was equal parts celebration and farewell, with toasts made to the endurance, adaptability, and sheer artistry that had carried them through. Looking back, what makes these behind-the-scenes stories so compelling is how closely they mirror the spirit of the film itself. Just as the characters survived through resilience, adaptation, and quiet acts of solidarity, so too did the people bringing their story to life. The ruins may have been constructed, the danger simulated, but the dedication and connection among those on set were entirely real. And perhaps that's why the finished film feels so authentic, not just because of its meticulous craftsmanship, but because, in its own way, it was forged under fire. War stories are often judged by the sweep of their battles or the gravity of their historical settings, but the lasting resonance comes from the ideas that hide beneath the smoke and rubble, the quiet questions whispered between gunshots, the lingering aftertaste of moral uncertainty. This film may be dressed in the uniforms of a sniper duel, but its themes run far deeper than military strategy. In every frame, it grapples with the contradictions of heroism, the murky borders between propaganda and truth, and the human cost of turning flesh and blood people into symbols for a cause. Its symbolism is not an afterthought. It is the bloodstream that runs through the entire narrative, binding plot and character into something far more profound than the sum of its scenes. One of the most persistent themes is the nature of heroism and how it is manufactured as much as it is earned. At first glance, the protagonist appears to embody the archetypal war hero, brave, skilled, and determined. But the film continually complicates that image. Early victories are seized upon by political officers, who quickly realize that his sharpshooting skill can be repackaged into a narrative of hope for the beleaguered Soviet people. This transformation from man to myth becomes one of the central tensions. He is not simply fighting an enemy, he is fighting against the weight of the image being built around him, one that threatens to consume his humanity. This struggle is made visible in the repeated imagery of the sniper's scope. The scope is both literal and symbolic, a tool of precision, a narrow tunnel through which the world is reduced to a single target. In a thematic sense, it mirrors the way propaganda narrows complex realities into simplified stories. The state chooses what it sees and erases everything beyond the crosshairs. Every time we look through the scope alongside the characters, we are reminded of how framing, whether in optics or politics, changes the meaning of what we witness. Parallel to heroism is the film's exploration of truth versus illusion. The political officer who befriends the protagonist begins as an ally, using his own skills with words and images to elevate his friend's reputation. But as the stakes grow higher, he becomes a custodian of a fiction, embellishing exploits, controlling the narrative, and suppressing inconvenient truths. This dance between reality and the story told about reality reflects a timeless theme. In war, the truth is not always the most useful weapon. Sometimes, the illusion of victory matters more than victory itself. The antagonist embodies another facet of this theme. He is not painted as a faceless villain, but as a man with his own code, his own story, and perhaps even his own reluctant respect for his opponent. In doing so, the film rejects the easy dichotomy of good and evil. Instead, it presents a mirror, each sniper reflecting the other's discipline, patience, and isolation. The duel is not merely a physical contest. It is a symbolic confrontation between two equally human soldiers trapped in the machinery of larger powers. Isolation itself becomes another major theme. Both snipers are alone, even when surrounded by comrades. Their work demands solitude, and their survival depends on being invisible. This physical aloneness seeps into their emotional lives, making genuine human connection both rare and dangerous. The love story that develops between the protagonist and the woman who shares his cause is therefore more than just a subplot. It is a fragile rebellion against the loneliness that war imposes. In their shared moments, the film reminds us that tenderness can exist even in the most brutal circumstances, and that love can be a form of resistance. Symbolism emerges in unexpected places. The Volga River, for example, is not just a geographical obstacle, but a kind of baptismal passage. Soldiers cross it under fire, shedding their former selves the moment they reach the opposite bank. Some never make it, swallowed by the water before they can even begin their fight. The river's current becomes a visual metaphor for inevitability. Once you step into the flow of war, you are carried forward, whether toward victory or toward death. The ruins of the city are another potent symbol. They are both the stage for the duel and a physical representation of the shattered lives and ideals of its inhabitants. The crumbling walls and hollowed buildings are more than set dressing. They are a visual chorus of loss, each ruin a monument to something that once stood whole. As the snipers maneuver through these spaces, their cat-and-mouse game becomes a macabre waltz in a ballroom where the music stopped long ago. Even smaller details carry symbolic weight. A dropped helmet rolling across the ground after a shot is fired, a bullet casing glinting in the dust, the sound of boots on rubble. These elements punctuate the film like fragments of a poem, each hinting at the human presence that lingers even after life has been extinguished. The duel itself is rich with symbolic layers. It is not just two men trying to kill each other. It is the embodiment of the larger war, distilled into a microcosm. Each move they make, each shot they take, is a test of patience, intellect, and willpower. The slow, deliberate pacing of these encounters contrasts sharply with the chaos of the larger battle, as if to say that in the midst of mass slaughter, the most decisive moments are often the quietest. Another theme woven through the story is the tension between individual agency and the impersonal machinery of war. Both snipers have remarkable personal skill, but their fates are still shaped by forces far beyond their control, political agendas, shifting battle lines, the weather, even sheer luck. This interplay between control and helplessness is underscored by recurring visual motifs, the protagonists peering through their scopes, entirely in control of their immediate target, while in the distance, artillery shells explode without warning, a reminder that no one is truly safe. The love story adds another symbolic dimension, the idea of shared vulnerability. In a world where survival often demands emotional detachment, the choice to love is both dangerous and defiant. Their stolen moments together are lit and framed differently from the rest of the film, warmer tones, closer camera work, softer focus, making them stand apart visually, as though they belong to another world. This contrast reinforces the notion that love, even if brief, is a sanctuary. The antagonist's death carries its own symbolic weight. It is not a triumphant, cathartic moment, but a quiet, almost mournful resolution. The duel ends, but the war continues, and in that truth lies the heart of the film's worldview. Victory is fleeting, and in war, the end of one battle is simply the beginning of another. The lack of a grand celebratory note forces the audience to confront the emptiness that follows even the most personal of victories. Perhaps the most haunting theme is the erosion of identity in wartime. The protagonist begins as an individual, but as his fame grows, he becomes an emblem, a figurehead. His personal story is rewritten to fit the needs of the state, and in the process, parts of who he is are erased. The sniper scope, once a symbol of clarity and control, becomes a cage, a narrow frame through which he sees the world, unable to step outside of the role he has been assigned. All these thematic threads are bound together by the film's visual and auditory symbolism. The muted color palette mirrors the moral grayness of the story. The recurring use of silence before decisive moments underscores the isolation and tension inherent in sniper warfare. The careful interplay between wide shots and extreme close-ups reflects the constant shift between the personal and the political, the individual and the collective. By the time the story reaches its conclusion, the audience has been led through a dense web of ideas. The manufacturing of heroes, the fragility of truth, the humanity of the enemy, the corrosive solitude of war, and the stubborn persistence of love. The symbolism is not ornamental, it is functional, shaping how we interpret each scene and how the characters' journeys resonate. In the end, the film leaves us with no easy answers. It invites us to question the stories we're told about war, to look closely at who benefits from them, and to remember that behind every legend is a human being, subject to the same fears, flaws, and fleeting joys as the rest of us. Its themes and symbols do not fade when the credits roll. They linger, unsettling and unforgettable, like the echo of a rifle shot in the cold air. Some stories demand that you look away, others make it impossible to. And then there are the rare few that compel you to keep looking, not because they are easy to watch, but because something in them is so deeply, insistently human that it refuses to let go. This film belongs to that third category, the kind of cinematic work that, once experienced, stays lodged in the mind, not as a series of images, but as a set of questions you can't stop turning over. We've traveled together through its layered terrain, beginning with the tension between myth and reality, tracing how one man's skill with a rifle was transformed into a narrative weapon more potent than any bullet. We saw how the state's hunger for symbols turned an individual into an emblem, stripping away his privacy, his choices, even pieces of his identity, in service of a story bigger than himself. That thread, the creation of a hero, wasn't simply about wartime propaganda. It was a lens through which we could examine the power of storytelling itself, how narrative can elevate, distort, and ultimately consume the very subject it celebrates. From there, we lingered in the quiet spaces between the battles, in those moments where the scope narrowed not just visually, but emotionally. In the duel between two snipers, we found more than tactical brilliance. We found a mirror, each man a reflection of the other, disciplined, patient, and equally trapped by the machinery of war. Their contest was less about ideology than it was about endurance, skill, and the inexorable pull of fate. We also stepped into the ruins of a city rendered with haunting authenticity. These shattered landscapes were not mere background. They were a chorus of silent witnesses, their jagged outlines telling a parallel story of destruction and resilience. Every scorched wall and broken window spoke of a life interrupted, a dream shattered, a family displaced. Through these spaces, we saw how the film's setting was as much a character as any human in the story, shaping mood, pacing, and meaning with every frame. Love, too, found its way into this narrative, not as an escape from the war, but as an act of defiance against it. The relationship between the sniper and his fellow fighter was never naive, never oblivious to the dangers that surrounded them. It was instead a recognition of shared vulnerability, a reminder that tenderness can survive even in the most inhospitable soil. Those moments were lit differently, framed differently, breathing a different rhythm into the story, and their beauty was all the more striking for the bleakness that surrounded them. We confronted the theme of truth versus illusion, how the stories told about war can matter more than the war itself, how reality is often less useful than a well-crafted fiction. The political officer's arc served as a cautionary tale about the seduction of narrative control, and how even well-intentioned manipulation can slide into self-serving deceit. And we saw how the protagonist, for all his courage, became ensnared in that deception, forced to live within a version of himself he didn't entirely recognize. The duel's resolution, quiet, understated, almost mournful, was the perfect summation of the film's refusal to indulge in hollow triumph. It resisted the easy release of a decisive victory, choosing instead to confront us with the emptiness that can follow even the most hard-won success. In doing so, it reminded us that war does not end neatly, and that the scars it leaves are not always visible. Alongside these thematic explorations, we dug into the film's cinematic language, its restrained color palette, its deliberate shifts between silence and chaos, its skillful balance of wide, desolate cityscapes with intimate, suffocating close-ups. These choices were not simply aesthetic, they were narrative tools, guiding our emotional engagement and subtly reinforcing the film's ideas. The Messiaen scene told as much of the story as the dialogue, the camera lingering in spaces where words would have been inadequate. The production itself was a story worth telling, the monumental sets that could be walked through like an actual city, the months spent constructing rubble with a historian's eye for accuracy, the countless small acts of coordination required to capture the duel's precision. All of these details revealed the labor behind the illusion. We heard about the camaraderie between cast and crew, the shared warmth that counterbalanced the cold physical demands of the shoot, the moments of levity that made the long days bearable. And we saw how the authenticity of the final product was the result not just of technical skill, but of a collective commitment to truthfulness, even in a fictional retelling. The film's strangeness and its trivia also left their mark, those unpredictable moments when pigeons ignored their cues, when weather transformed the set, when an unplanned detail was embraced and woven into the fabric of the scene. These behind-the-scenes glimpses deepened our understanding of the finished work, reminding us that cinema is not a rigid blueprint, but a living, breathing collaboration between intention and chance. And then there was the symbolic architecture of the story, the scope as a metaphor for narrowed perspective, the Volga as a river of transformation and inevitability, the ruins as monuments to loss, the love story as a fragile sanctuary. These symbols did not exist in isolation. They were in constant dialogue with the themes, each reinforcing the other, each adding a layer of meaning that would be easy to miss if one only watched for the gunfights. By the time we've reached this point in our exploration, it's clear that what makes the film unforgettable is not just its historical setting, nor even the skill with which it stages its sniper duels. It is the depth of its questions, the way it draws us into a moral and emotional terrain where victories feel uncertain and truth is slippery. It invites us not just to watch, but to interpret, to doubt, to reconsider. And perhaps that is why this film continues to resonate, especially for those of us who come to cinema as literature lovers, as seekers of layered narratives, of symbols that breathe, of stories that can hold contradictions without collapsing under them. It rewards the kind of viewing that is active, attentive, and unafraid of ambiguity. It trusts us to handle complexity, to resist easy answers, and to carry its questions with us long after the credits roll. If you've been with me through this journey, then you already know the kind of space we try to create here, a space where we don't just consume films, but converse with them, turning them over in our minds like pages in a well-worn book. If that's the kind of conversation you want more of, then I'd love for you to join me here regularly. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next time we peel back the layers of another cinematic work and let its deeper meanings rise to the surface. Because in the end, films like this aren't just stories, they're invitations. Invitations to think harder, to feel more deeply, and to look again at the narratives that shape our world. And as long as there are films that dare to do that, we'll have more to talk about.